Well, hello, folks, and welcome back to the final and concluding part of our Rise of the Third Reich week. It seems to have absolutely flown by. I've had some amazing conversations. And today we are looking at the Russian-German relationship. And before I introduce my guest, I'm reminded of the shows I did last year about the French resistance, particularly the one with Dr. Chris Millington, where we talked about the words resistance and collaboration, how loaded they were. And he decided that defiance and accommodation were better words. Well, as often I talk about in the intro to these shows, I do some bad research before a show. And in looking at this relationship, I've seen all sorts of words used to describe how the Germans and Russians dealt with each other over that period. Friendship, pact, agreement, I forgot what the other ones were now. It's complicated, though. Each of those was partnership, another one. They come loaded with a meaning. And in just discussing with my guest a couple of minutes ago, they're all not quite right to describe the relationship. They have elements of truth because it went over 20 years. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce my guest. He refers to this deal, this partnership, this pact as a Faustian bargain. That is the book there. And it is one of the ones that I have to say, folks, was a game changer for me. And as always, the links are in the description below, so you can find out how to purchase it there or at any bookstore of your choice or online as you see fit. So my guest, Professor Ian Johnson, teaches history. I want to say Notre Dame, but I've got to say Notre Dame because that's how it is over there. So I've got over that pronunciation hiccup immediately, but that's where he teaches, Professor of Military History. So without further ado, good afternoon, Dave. Ian, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well. So I'm glad I've got over that Notre Dame thing because that was been stressing me out all day.
Appreciate that. You nailed it.
Good. So this language, this complicated relationship, this is one of the things that you try and unravel amongst many other subjects with your book there. So why did you call it a Faustian bargain, and what was the reason you wanted to tackle this subject? It's something that has been tackled before, but what brought you to it?
Absolutely. Yes. So the title Faustian bargain comes essentially out of how each side understood their partnership with the other. For the Germans working with the revolutionary regime in Moscow, it was like working with the devil. In fact, they used the word the devil in their private correspondence when they talked about the Soviets. And for the Soviets, the German military officers who were in charge of the Reichswehr, many of them were aristocratic. They were literally the embodiment of Soviet propaganda, the bad guys in Soviet propaganda. So for each of them, it was about making a deal with an odious and hated foe to achieve various national interests. So Faustian bargain, this idea of a deal with the devil, seemed to sum it up pretty perfectly from both sides.
Indeed, and in some ways, the only thing they have in common is they hate each other. I mean, that's a very, very kind of simple way of saying it, but it is sort of in truth. Their aims are different, their aspirations, their ideologies, but there is a sort of shared hatred of the other.
Absolutely. And in fact, amazingly, I've spent a lot of time in Moscow and in the archives there. Over this 20-year relationship, the Soviets consistently refer to the Germans as friends in quotation marks. 20 years of collaboration and close partnership. They're always in quotation marks. There's always an understanding that the partnership is one of opportunism to some degree, and that it very well might unravel at any moment.
Wow, that says it all, really. So we've got a list of things we're going to ask you. And folks, because we're covering, as Ian said, their 20-year period of history, we're probably going to get to the things you may want to ask questions about as we go through the discussion. So hold your questions for the end. And if we haven't covered them, then you can fire away. Please, of course, give us comments. We'll put them up on screen, but we'll probably leave the questions to the end like we did with Katia Hoyer on Monday, because it's a big, long, complicated subject. We have a lot to go through. But without further ado, we're going to kind of carry on with it now. So, Ian, we have to, of course, start at the end of the First World War, which we covered on Monday, and indeed Roger Morehouse talked about that on Wednesday as well. It's the rather less than satisfactory end to that conflict brought about the set of situations that led to all the various relationships between all the countries there. So what did the USSR and the Germany have? What interest did they have in working with each other as that war came to a close?
Well, it is interesting. Their relationship begins before the guns have fallen silent on the Western Front. Part of it was the fact that the Germans had been responsible in part for getting Lenin back to Russia to help overthrow the provisional government there in 1917. They had a relationship of sorts, even if it was a very untrusting one. When Germany signed a peace deal with Lenin's Bolsheviks in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they normalized relations. It was the first normal relationship, essentially in diplomatic terms, between the Bolsheviks and any other government. So as the Russian Civil War played out and as the First World War came to a close in Western Europe, essentially this partnership began to develop, an economic partnership. There was intelligence sharing of various kinds. And after some interruptions, there was a revolution in Germany, of course, there was the Russian Civil War. They began working together with increasingly closely in 1920 and 1921. Brought together by their shared hostility to the international order that the victorious allies were trying to construct in the Treaty of Versailles with the League of Nations. The Bolsheviks, of course, wanted world revolution and the export of their revolution as quickly as possible. And the Germans were obviously upset by the terms of Versailles, the loss of 10% of their national territory, and above all, the actual defeat of Germany in the First World War. Everyone talks about the Treaty of Versailles as this creating this tremendous incentive for eventually for Hitler and for the outbreak of the Second World War. That's true, certainly to an extent. But fundamentally, the German officer corps, the folks that I study in this book, they actually don't want to just overturn Versailles. They want to overturn the results of the First World War. They
Right.
fundamentally want to create a German-centered Europe by fighting a new war.
Wow. And, this is harking back to some of the things Katia said on Monday. But given what has just happened, this conflict, that there has to be resistance from both sides about so swiftly after that war, kind of working with people who, you had been on opposite sides to very, very recently. So there is a benefit to working together because of this, as you said there, this distrust, hatred, what do you want to call it, of the new order. But at the same time, it's not going to go down well in some quarters. So how do they overcome this resistance, and who was resisting within each nation this prospective working operation?
Yeah, so German side, it's important to understand that the terms of Versailles, they do matter quite a bit here. So the German military, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, they were stripped of their tanks, their aircraft, chemical weapons, submarines, a lot of the modern equipment necessary for waging war. Allied inspectors were stationed across Germany to oversee the destruction of German industries. In addition, of course, the German army was reduced from about 5 million to only 100,000 men, these enormous reductions. So the German military, what's left of the senior officer corps, what had been the general staff, their essential aim is to find a way to rebuild German military power. And they can't do it in Germany because of the Allied inspection teams, the presence of Allied troops. And so this is why they immediately become interested in a potential partnership with Soviet Russia. They see this as one of the few states in the international system just as angry and hostile to, say, Great Britain and France, and possibly a willing partner in undermining the international order. And the German civilian government, led initially by the Social Democratic Party after the German Revolution, they're a lot less keen. And much of the German government is split between what becomes known as the Ostpolitik faction, the Eastern politics faction, that thinks working with the Soviets is a good idea, and the other side essentially being what's known as the politics of fulfillment faction. Mm-hmm. Their aim is to essentially get rid of Versailles by collaborating with the British and French, trying to get along, trying to reintegrate into Western Europe. And those sides are very much obviously opposed. What the German military decides to do is let's just essentially not tell their own civilian government and begin operating essentially along the terms of their own foreign policy, beginning in about 1920. So there is resistance, which is essentially overcome by cutting the German civilian government out until about 1926. On the Soviet side, there's willingness, essentially, regardless of the different factions within the Bolsheviks, to work with Germany for a variety of reasons. On one hand, they essentially are willing to continue pushing revolution in Germany while working with the government. They see that as a contradiction. For them, there's less of an ideological concern, at least at first, because the assumption is Germany will eventually become a fellow communist state.
Right.
It's interesting to note that so Trotsky is the one who's leading the charge on this at first. He's the head of the Red Army. Stalin actually uses the politics of this question, working with Germany, to help drive Trotsky out of control of the Red Army. He says we're not getting enough from the Germans, helped drive Trotsky into exile eventually, and then, of course, expand cooperation under his own supervision, especially after 1929 when he's firmly in charge.
Well, wonderful explanation to start that off there. And there's a picture of Trotsky there that you supplied us there. And it's, you know, I think because of the focus on the 1939 relationship and the pact that came in there, I think we are overlooking these earlier deal, or the earlier deal that was established at our peril, because it's, as we know, some major players involved in it. And as you make the case in your book, some very, very important factors to do this, particularly the side that really impressed me, and we'll get to it later, is the technology side of it. And I know I'm skipping ahead what we're going to be talking about, but some real major players in this. So you mentioned Trotsky there. When did they, you talked about 1920, then we're going to talk about 1922, but when did they start working together, and who are the key players in getting these two nations together?
Yes, so on the German side, Hans von Seeckt is the key character. He essentially heads the Reichswehr, the German army, from 1920 to 1926. And in that role, his fundamental aim is to rehabilitate German military power. He can't do most of the things he wants to do in Germany. And explicitly, those things are to train German officers on new technologies of war. The German officer corps is very small after Versailles. He wants them to become the most professional and technologically up-to-date officer corps in the world. They need to be able to actually drive tanks and fly planes to do so, and he can't do that in Germany. So that's one of his aims. He also wants to relocate banned industrial production. All the things Germany couldn't make at home, tanks and planes, relocate that banned industry to the USSR. And the final piece was actually developing new technologies of war themselves, the new prototypes that could serve as the basis for future German rearmament. So Seeckt is driving the story on the German side. On the Soviet side, Trotsky is the key figure in the early stages of the relationship, again, essentially running the Red Army from the Russian Civil War through 1925 or so. His aims are essentially to take a devastated Soviet state, one that essentially was the economy had collapsed after the Russian Civil War. Typhus and cholera were rampant. Most of the Red Army barely has uniforms, let alone working weapons. He thinks partnership with the Germans can lead to industrialization, can lead to modern equipment for his troops. And most importantly, he thinks the Germans, who were clearly, in his mind, and he writes about this, the best and most effective military in the First World War. He thinks they have a lot of lessons to teach, and he wants them to train a fresh generation of Soviet officers who will be politically reliable and loyal. Because in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, most Red Army officers were from the Tsarist army. Many of them were aristocrats or middle class, and they were viewed as untrustworthy. So Trotsky thinks he can essentially use the Germans to develop that new officer corps. So it's with this in mind that they began their surreptitious talking in 1919 and 1920. There's this incredible incident where the German high command, or what's left of it, they send war criminal Enver Pasha, who's in hiding in Germany, on this perilous flight. He crash lands and has to be broken out of prison and eventually makes his way to Moscow. And he begins sending telegraph messages back and forth from Berlin to Moscow in 1920. And by that juncture, it's clear that there's a number of avenues of potential collaboration. At that point, they're already exchanging intelligence against the Poles, with whom the Soviets are at war and the Germans hate. So by 1920, the basis for a potential relationship is really there.
And then, of course, we'll move on to the Rapallo Agreement in 1922 and the beginning of the layers of these agreements, pacts, because there's sort of the public version, then there's the sort of next level of slightly secret, and then there's the kind of the secret stuff beyond that, because it's a complex relationship that both sides they're working together, but already they're starting kind of spying on each other as well. So there's multiple layers to it. So just to stop about the presentation and talk about the researching of this. You talked about researching in Moscow and Germany. I mean, was it a question of just when you began this? I know you did it for your dissertation when you back in the day, but the layers, did they surprise you how many layers there were to this? Was the onion bigger than you thought it was going to be?
Yes, I was very lucky when I embarked on the dissertation project. A lot of people have written about this relationship in a variety of ways. There's quite a bit of good material on the diplomatic side. Yeah. There's even some on military collaboration in broad strokes. People like John Erickson have written really well about that. But what was missing from the story was that what actually was being done at these various secret facilities. Nobody had really done a deep dive into the actual nitty gritty of the relationship on using archival material from both countries. That was my sense. And so I was very fortunate when I got to Germany. One of the big things that I did that had not really been fully done was I went to the corporations that were involved. There were a lot of German firms involved, and they were, I will say, the archivists there are completely open, very transparent. I had no difficulty working there, of course. Working in Russia can be a little more complicated. Again, I had great relationships with archivists and a great deal of support, but you have to make sure there are certain political standards for what's available and what's not. And I would say I was very fortunate that I had access to a great deal, and I found a lot more that I think had not really been seen on the relationship, certainly than I even expected in the archives.
Well, that's a great answer. So assuming that my viewers know nothing about the official agreement, the Rapallo agreement, give us like a 2-minute version of that and what the world thought it was. And then, if you wouldn't mind, kind of go unravel this secret network below it and sort of get to grips with what that really means for both countries.
Sure, yeah. So the Treaty of Rapallo was a treaty signed in April 1922 that normalized relations between Germany and the Soviet Union. Essentially, they would have diplomatic representation. They'd treat each other as normal countries. This was a big step forward for the Soviets, their first really official, capitalist state acknowledging them and treating them as a legitimate sovereign state. So the official elements are pretty benign, simply exchanging diplomats, opening economic ties, etc. But there were military representatives accompanying both delegations, and they had been meeting secretly in Berlin before this treaty was signed and continued meeting afterwards. And essentially what eventually came out of this treaty was broad-scale military cooperation. In its first phase, it was about relocating banned industrial production, things that were the Germans couldn't make at home, relocating entire factories, engineering teams, financial capital to the USSR, where things like aircraft and chemical weapons could be manufactured away from the eyes of the victorious Allies. And gradually that relationship deepened and expanded as Germany began to send military officers to train their Soviet counterparts and eventually reopen entire bases in the USSR dedicated to rebuilding German military might and training hundreds of German officers and men.
Well, this was the first bit when I was reading your book that really, changed my perception about this, because I'd come from that old school version of the Allies and everybody else in the world being surprised by Germany's sudden military might that it had in the sort of mid to late 1930s, and like everybody else, kind of thinking it comes out of nowhere with like a wave of a magic wand. And what you did is you built up this secret side of it, where within the Soviet Union, the Germans are creating, they're setting things up, and that I may have read a little bit about it, but it was the fact you went through it in such detail and the size of it and the number of, we could go into a whole rabbit hole of just how many German generals that we know about. Manstein, Keitel were involved in visiting these places, and how many senior officers went through the facilities over there and got ideas and things. I mean, it was, as I said in the top of the show, it was a mind-blowing moment for me when I was reading that book there. So explain to viewers just the extent of what's going on. What are Germany moving into Soviet Union? What are their reasons for it? And also, why would the Soviet Union allow this to be happening? As aren't they worried about what the Germans might be doing with it?
Yeah, big questions. Yeah, so briefly, what this network looked like in its initial phase, again, it was German corporations, and a huge number would become involved, 255 or so German firms, including most of the country's aircraft and vehicle production companies, begin relocating assembly lines, expertise to these various facilities, some of which you can see on this map. So Bersol was a major chemical weapons facility, huge complex. We're talking several thousand employees operating outside of Samara. Fili, which began operations just outside of Moscow in 1923, becomes one of the largest aircraft facilities in the USSR, home of the first Soviet four-engine bomber. So that cooperation takes off first. And then we see the Germans dispatching training, basically World War I aces, to train Soviet pilots at Lipetsk in south-central Russia, which is, I've spent some time there. It's pretty warm for Russia, so this was seen as a good spot for flying. Weather's pretty good. This is actually where the Russian Top Gun fighter academy is today.
Right.
Same base. There was German aces, Second World War, ironically. So after that begins to take off and is quite successful, and the Soviets are quite happy with how training is going. Essentially, the Germans are offered a lease on the entire base. They're told, listen, if you will continue to train Soviet personnel, and you will give us access to any technology that you might bring to this facility, you can do whatever you want. The Germans say, thank you very much. And they begin dispatching initially small groups, but eventually hundreds of young men to essentially go through a fighter pilot training course. 7 of Germany's 8 aircraft manufacturers are sending literally dozens of secret combat prototypes for testing and development. And essentially, we see the entire Luftwaffe reborn at this Russian airfield in exchange for, again, Soviet Russia being able to access the technology and train their own people alongside the Germans. And Lipyatsk proved so successful that we see Soviets and Germans begin expanding cooperation. They opened Potasinki, a chemical weapons base just outside of Moscow in 1926. This proves to be a bit of a problem because they're spraying chemical agents from the air, and this is only about a dozen miles from the Kremlin. It turns out they're accidentally spraying people in Moscow's suburbs, so they decide to move the base far out, and they move it to outside of Samara to a place called Tomka, which essentially becomes the home of the German chemical weapons program until 1933. I mean, we're talking everybody in the program relocates there. And then as that proves successful, they also open a joint tank facility at Kama outside of Kazan, where they're doing the same thing, training hundreds of armored officers, bringing in prototypes, and essentially developing tactics and operational doctrine. So this network at its peak, we're talking thousands upon thousands of officers and men. We're talking about the involvement of most of Germany's large military manufacturers, and essentially every part of the Soviet government being involved in some way, shape, or form. So this becomes enormously significant, this network in this period.
Well, but you're talking about pilots or perhaps a tank officer being in one of these environments, learning and exchanging ideas. But give us and the viewers an idea of exactly how open and free were these settings. I mean, if you were a pilot or an officer there, are you kind of sharing canteens? Are they separate within the base? Are they bounded by rules? What can they say? Are there people sort of standing behind them, making sure they don't say the wrong thing? What kind of environment is it for either the Germans or Soviets?
Yeah, when the Germans first start showing up, they're treated as if they're plague bearers. They're locked in their facilities basically at night. They're told not to fraternize with any of the Russians on these facilities. They're actually, under the terms of some of these agreements, they're required to attend lectures on Soviet economic and political doctrine. So they're trying to force feed Marxism down the throats of these mostly aristocratic German officers, which they don't take particularly seriously. So at first, it's a fairly fraught relationship. But as the cooperation expands and more Germans are arriving in the USSR, gradually some of these facilities become fairly and relatively open. So at the major chemical weapons facility at Tomka, we know that they start throwing joint parties, that they're living in pretty close accord with each other. All the Soviet officers are required to speak German, so they communicate quite freely. At Lipyatsk, which is the largest base throughout this period, they're training alongside each other. Again, there's a New Year's party every year to which both sides come. They're allowed to travel into town. This actually begins to create problems in the early 30s when they start having a very large number of young German men who begin dating local women. And I've seen some of the records of the secret police in that time. They periodically will do roundups and arrest all of their girlfriends from the local town, rather grimly. Some of them, I've seen the arrest records. They're not released until the 50s. So that obviously was a danger if you were a local and encountering the Germans. The relationship becomes more open over time, and we see some relationships develop that are quite close. In fact, there's a story of a senior German diplomat who's very intimately involved, who has a picture of himself with Kliment Voroshilov, who's will eventually become Minister of Defense in the Soviet state. And when the Red Army approaches his estate, he uses this picture to avoid being shot by approaching Red Army troops. An indication, they'd gone duck hunting together, I believe, and there was a photo of the two of them together. So there were moments when the relationship became quite intimate. But of course, trust, especially at the higher levels, was always at something of a premium.
Well, and of course, we're talking about during an era when the governments of these respective countries are evolving and shaping as well. It's not like the things are the same in 1930 as they were in 1922 in each of these countries. So obviously, that's going to be having an effect as well. So the other question, of course, is what did the world know about this point here? I mean, I'm guessing not a lot, really. If you could expand on that. I mean, the world has seen this, this formal kind of diplomatic deal being struck in 1922, but I'm assuming that the press aren't invited, the international press aren't invited to these air bases. So is there any, Britain and France being the big players there? What are they aware of through this period of the relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union?
So the Germans and Soviets are trying to do everything imaginable to conceal their activities, as you might imagine. The Germans are afraid if they get caught, the British and French will occupy the whole country. They're clearly violating the Treaty of Versailles and a lot of their other international agreements. So the stakes are pretty high for the Germans. And the Soviets are terrified they're going to be caught in this embarrassing situation where they're arming and assisting these right-wing officers who have actually put down at least 3 communist uprisings in Germany by this juncture. It's an uncomfortable relationship if it became public. So they do things like they weld tractor plows on the fronts of tank prototypes headed to the USSR. If someone lifted it up, these things have 37 millimeter cannons with them. So, someone might figure that one out fairly quickly. But they're trying to do all these elements of secrecy. The German officers ostensibly are resigning from the German army in this period and traveling as tourists to the Soviet Union. Again, how many tourists were arriving in the USSR in, say, 1930? Not a lot. So some of these measures maybe don't conceal the story as fully as they would like. And this leads to a number of problems. So first, the Poles have excellent intelligence in this period. I've worked in the Polish archives. They know quite a bit. And they're very concerned, obviously, about their 2 neighbors working together, as it turns out they should have been.
Yeah, rightly so, yeah.
Yes, this relationship does not bode well for the future of Poland. The Poles are going to pass intelligence to the British and French repeatedly throughout this period, and with a fair degree of accuracy. So from what I can tell, both the British and French governments had a fair degree of knowledge, particularly after about 1925, about what exactly was being done at these various facilities. In terms of public awareness, of course, these measures are largely secret, but there's a huge scandal in 1926. It's broken by a Manchester Guardian journalist named Augustus Voigt, who is he's British but speaks fluent German. His family had a background and connections to Germany. He's friends with a lot of German parliamentarians, some of whom begin passing him information about some of the secret facilities that they're actually learning about through hearings basically being conducted in the Reichstag, secret hearings. An article appears in the Manchester Guardian in December 1926. It says the Soviets are rearming Germany. They're selling weapons to them. The Germans are building weapon systems in the USSR. This leads to the collapse of the German government. There's enormous hue and cry, public outrage, and essentially nothing happens. There's a brief pause in the relationship to avoid any particularly damaging revelations. And after essentially the Soviets forced the German civilian government and military to sit down and have a little powwow and discuss what each side is going to share with the other and collaborate a little more closely and get the secrecy thing sorted out, collaboration actually expands. So there are a couple of scandals in this period which have essentially no impact on the overall relationship, which is continued to expand until about 1931 or 32.
Well, you just mentioned the end of that 31, 32, because we're going to get to the era where obviously things substantially change within Germany and Hitler comes to power. But before we kind of move to that chapter there, is there anything, particularly for the military people watching this, those that like their tanks and aircraft and technology, is there anything in that kind of previous era that is significant that we should sort of take forward? Any particular shared ideas or piece of technology? I mean, we know that the Russian tank designs are often based on things that the West were using, and the Germans are borrowing little ideas back and forth. Is there any particular thing you think, well, we ought to mention that before we move on?
Absolutely. Yes, technology is a huge part of the story. Again, The Germans aren't able to develop any domestic technologies in this period. Everything they're producing in terms of tanks and aircraft is going for testing to the USSR. I think it's important to note in this period, it took about 4 to 6 years to develop a tank or an aircraft prototype from scratch. When the specifications were issued, 4 to 6 years was really the minimum before a vehicle was ready for mass production and would be a reliable vehicle. It could be accelerated a little bit, but not a lot. What this period of secret rearmament allows is the German military to develop an entire generation of prototypes, which mostly don't go into mass production. Actually, there are quite a few aircraft designs that will begin mass production in 1933 that are tested in the USSR. But by and large, what it does is it allows, when Hitler comes to power, the mass production of a huge range of vehicles and aircraft based on the experience of testing and design work conducted in the USSR. So the Panzers 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all designed by engineering teams that were living in the USSR, all based on engineering work conducted in the USSR. Again, some of these teams lived there for years on end. They borrowed components from their Soviet counterparts when they liked them, including the famous three-man turret that appears on a number of German designs. That's essentially borrowed from the Soviets, from vehicles that they're seeing as they work alongside the USSR. In terms of aircraft, it's a very similar story, particularly for fighter aircraft and some aircraft used as tactical support, air support. So the famous Stuka dive bomber, that's developed from the K-47, which is first tested and developed at Lipetsk and essentially modified and updated before mass production. So most of Germany's aircraft and tanks, most of the ones that they would use in the Second World War, are direct products of this period of collaboration made by people, in many instances, who were living and working in the USSR. And on the Soviet side, it's important to understand, the Soviets had almost no basis for mass production of aircraft or tanks when they took power. The Russian Empire had not produced a single functioning tank in the First World War. Their aircraft industry was in a disastrous state. They only had 73 planes supporting the Red Army in the mid-20s. Not so great. And so essentially, with German help, they are reverse engineering enormous range of technologies. Of course, they're borrowing from Great Britain, a great deal from France, from the United States. A lot of that is being mediated by German firms and by German engineers. So a huge number of vehicles and aircraft designs are going to have German engines, 4 classes of Soviet submarines, most of their fighters and bombers, either German, French, or American engines, many of which were reverse engineered with German help. So it's quite remarkable, but if we actually look when at 1941 in Operation Barbarossa, a lot of the vehicles are essentially, they share a sort of engineering genealogy and stuff that had been developed in conjunction back in the 1920s and early 30s.
It's kind of like the evolution idea that humans and chimpanzees are sharing this common ancestor. That this period of the 20s and early 30s is, you can see, although the German and Soviet vehicles are different, you can see, like French and British, English coming from Latin, you can see that common kind of ancestry there. But and I'm glad you expanded on this idea. If I'm going to kind of summarize it, the Germans are kind of honing specific types, specific aircraft tank types, whereas maybe the Soviets are kind of learning more the basic principles, the engineering. They're looking at just the masses, the means of mass production and production lines. They're looking at the broad concepts and the industrialization. Is that kind of how the deal is working at this point there?
Absolutely, yeah. And to facilitate that, you've got German engineers, people like Joseph Vollmer, who built the first German tanks in the First World War. He goes and he heads a design bureau in the USSR where he's training many of these very, very young Soviet engineers, teaching them how to do the basics. And this is really the beginnings of the Soviet tank production. It's inspired in large part by German assistance.
And brilliant. Before we move on to the Hitler taking power, I want to just address something that, again, you talk about in the book. Is this, we're talking about the technology there, but also the ideologies are being seen and examined by either side. Is because when we get to the later and Barbarossa and some of the horrors we know that the Third Reich committed as they pushed their way east, some of the key figures had been exposed by visiting the Soviet Union to what communism meant and the ideologies behind it. And it does it. You made this case that it's kind of sowing this seed in some of these German officers' minds that although they're kind of happy to borrow the technology and use its facilities, it's reinforcing this idea that these people are very different to us, and perhaps not even their people at all. They're not like us. So So when we get to the horrors of the Holocaust, how important do you think is this era in each side fundamentally understanding what the other side represents?
Absolutely. Yes, I think this is a key part of the story, sort of the social history of the German officer corps and the Soviet officer corps. So on the German side, what we see, I think, are two very different reactions to living in the USSR. There are some senior, particularly senior officers and older officers, often trained before the First World War. They come in and they are impressed by what the Soviet Union is able to do. The mass mobilization, mass industrialization, they say this is really impressive. So generals like Werner von Blomberg, who does a number of tours of facilities in the USSR, he says that he becomes a Nazi. He says this repeatedly because of his experience in the Soviet Union. He said he saw what could be gotten out of the masses, what Stalin was doing, and he wanted to bring that back to Germany. And of course, he is the one who shepherds the army into the Nazi era as Minister of Defense. For a lot of younger officers, they're living at these bases. Again, many of these are 19, 20, 21-year-old men. And I've seen the Soviet secret police files on a number of them. I was very fortunate to get access to them. So you can actually watch in the police records as they transform in terms of their political views. Because especially in 31 and 32, the Soviet Union embarks on collectivization, the concentration of agriculture and confiscation of the Soviet state. It's produced a horrific famine. That's particularly in 1932. And most of these bases are in the famine zone created by collectivization. These young men are watching starving peasants being shot off the fences of the facility as they're trying to get access to food on the bases. They're seeing corpses and they're reporting them, sometimes in their diaries, in the towns near these bases. This is a very traumatic event. So for a lot of the younger officers, it convinces them essentially that communism is this horrific force for evil and must be destroyed at all costs. It also, in many cases, reinforces their own sort of scientific racism and views of the Soviet Union and Russians that they might have already had. And we see officers like Manstein. He essentially says the Soviet Union, his experience in the USSR convinced him to back Nazi policies of extermination. So we see quite surprisingly different outcomes. And just briefly to talk about the Soviet side, what they saw in the Germans, it's quite different. My impression is, I should know, so many of the Soviet officers who participated in these exchanges were executed in the Great Purges in 1937 and 38. Many of them seem to have gotten quite fond of their German counterparts and quite impressed by the German state and the German military. This is clearly one of the reasons that the purges take place, in my estimation, is that there was an enthusiasm for German modernization and modernity and what Germany represented that Stalin saw as a threat that rendered his officer corps perhaps less than reliable in the event of a future war. So we have less of a complete picture on the Soviet side because so many of the men involved are dead by the time the Second World War begins.
And that is in itself, again, very revealing because they'd seen beyond, they'd kind of gone native. The Soviets who had seen the Germans there have kind of seen it and almost been enticed by some of it. And then, and we, we've talked about in previous shows, Sean McMeekin, others, David Stalin, what have you, about the purges and how that leaves the Soviet army, Red Army, very undermanned with people who knew what they were doing when you start the war off. Prit Buttar has talked about that at great length. So to think that part of that reasoning of the purges is because they've been kind of been westernized in a sense. They've been affected by those German people they've been dealing with. And it comes back to this idea of people living in a sense on campus together. It's like, I live just down the road from Coin University where people come from different parts of the world and they start off kind of separate. And then once you've spent weeks together, it becomes a community. You're exposed to the best and worst of each nation. I suppose that's what's happening at these bases. They're getting a complete view in a sense, whereas the 20s is an era of managed propaganda by all the nations. All of us are guilty of it, of sending out to the world what we want to say about our nations, not necessarily how the nations function kind of below that surface level. So it's important to recognize what these officers in these exchange programs are actually experiencing during this time. But it brings us to the Hitler taking power. Now, we talked on Monday about Hitler's ambitions, his strong personality, his aims, his the Mein Kampf and what have you. When he takes power and finds out about this ongoing process. What's his initial feeling about it, and what does he do?
Well, interestingly, Hitler is well aware of much of what's being done in the USSR as early as 1928. So he writes a second book, which is not published. He has a whole chapter on partnership with the Soviets. So, the Nazis were very, very popular within the ranks of the German army. In fact, by 1930, the German army already estimates a majority of the officer corps are pro-Nazi. So Hitler's being fed information by all of these Nazi party members, many of them secretly, from the ranks of the Reichswehr, the German army. He thinks it's a bad idea in general terms. His primary aim is the destruction of communism in this period. And of course, his conspiratorial anti-Semitic worldview, he associates the Jewish conspiracy with the Soviet state, and it's all intermeshed. So one would assume when he came to power, he would immediately break off all ties. But this isn't actually quite what happens. Essentially, he begins relocating much of the training and testing from the USSR to Germany, but primarily not because he doesn't care about it, or he's concerned about this sort of work being conducted in the USSR. It's just primarily he doesn't think the British or French will stop him from doing this sort of development and testing at home, and it's much cheaper and easier to do it at home. So in fact, for about 9 months after Hitler comes to power, there are still functioning German bases in the Soviet Union. His speeches in front of the Stag are fairly, they're certainly not particularly hostile to the USSR. It's really, the relationship slowly decays. Their last vestiges of it really aren't severed until 1935. There's some joint work being conducted by German firms helping the Soviets develop submarines. That's still continuing up until that date. But by that point, as Germany gets stronger and as German rearmament accelerates, Hitler becomes increasingly open about both his political views, his worldviews, his anti-Semitism, and increasingly we see a strident tone against the USSR. So it's not a relationship that's immediately severed, but it's one that once Hitler feels comfortable and strong enough, that does obviously deteriorate and end. And
is it also because, in a sense, the mine has now been, the seam is now empty? There's not much else they can get now. It's 35. They've built up their military. The world is beginning to kind of realize what Germany is going on. So the benefits have now kind of naturally come to an end anyway. Is that also the case?
It is, to a large extent. Though, interestingly, Hitler repeatedly, and really beginning in 1936, there is continued chatter about the possibility of renewing the partnership to some degree. Hitler didn't want the sort of close collaboration that had gone on in the earlier period. What he wanted was Soviet oil. He wanted rubber. He wanted whatever raw materials he could get from the USSR to fuel Germany's rearmament drive. But in every instance, the Soviets said, that's great, but we need broader political rapprochement, and we want to resume the sort of military partnership we had earlier in exchange. And Hitler was never willing to do that. So it's important to understand, as bad as their public relationship gets and the propaganda they're heaping on each other, behind the scenes, they are consistently talking about some sort of New Deal.
Yeah, and of course, it's probably an apt time, especially because we've come off the show with Roger Morehouse on Wednesday, to kind of bring Poland into the story, because through this era, Poland starts becoming important to both the Soviets and the Germans there. So as things kind of gear up, we will obviously talk about the 1939 Pact, but kind of run us through any kind of key moments in that sort of 34, 35 up to 39 period, and how Poland starts becoming part of the story.
Well, Hitler had hoped to build a coalition against the USSR. That was his hope. He thought he could bring in many of the smaller states of the Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe, and he thought he might be able to dissuade the British and French from intervention and essentially turn this coalition against the USSR. But of course, to do so, one would have to accept a subordinate status in a Nazi-dominated Europe, as well as giving up a chunk of territory that it had acquired from Germany after the First World War. So the Polish government is very consistent in this period. They don't want to make a deal with either the Soviets or the Germans. Instead, they try to rely very closely on their partnership with France. They also try to build partnerships with neighboring states like Romania, in the hopes of developing the Little Entente, as it was known, into some sort of defensive pact strong enough to deter both the Soviets and the Germans. Interestingly, Hitler doesn't really abandon efforts to bring Poland on board with a Nazi alliance against the USSR until in March 1939, Neville Chamberlain issues a guarantee to Poland, guaranteeing its sovereignty and its borders. This is because Hitler had essentially torn up the Munich agreements of the previous fall. He'd invaded what was left of Czechoslovakia, and the government of Neville Chamberlain correctly recognized that Hitler could not be trusted, and any agreement was worthless. At that point, they issued the guarantee to Poland. And at that point, there was really a crisis in European diplomacy, because for the Germans, that meant Poland was not going to collaborate with some sort of Nazi crusade against the Soviet Union. And for Poland itself, Poland was too weak to fend off either of its large neighbors without considerable assistance. Really, the only way a partnership between Great Britain and Poland might have succeeded in deterring Hitler was if the Soviets would back the Poles and provide military support. But for Poland, with long memories of Tsarist control and fears about the Soviet Union, of course, the Soviets had nearly destroyed Poland during the Polish-Bolshevik War in 1920 and 1921, the Poles weren't super willing to do that. And so what we see in 1939 is this constant back and forth where the British and French are trying to build a coalition strong enough to deter Hitler in Eastern Europe, but no coalition is really possible for a variety of these reasons I've already described.
Yeah, and what we can end up reinforcing the idea is to pity Poland's situation there, because they can't be seen to back one horse or the other horse. They're stuck. It's just that anyone Roger Moore has so ably explained on Wednesday. No one would want to be in the Polish government in that 30s period, because every option open to you is just fraught with potential pitfalls, and we now know what their fate was. So just to remind our viewers, poor Poland in this situation, but. Bringing it back to the Soviets and the Germans, so the relationship has kind of soured a bit, but now mentioned 1939, things are hotting up on both sides, and this is the stage that more of my viewers will be familiar with, the famous Pact of 1939. So, which of the nations kind of suggested it? Who kind of broached the idea first? And again, to expand on that, what would both sides be getting out of it? And surely there's going to be resistance to going into it. I mean, there's a lot of questions in one go there, but set the scene of why it came about.
Yeah, well, Roger Moorhouse's terrific work on this has done a lot to reveal the story fully. So the traditional narrative, if you read work 10, 15 years ago, was that essentially Stalin was trying to cobble together some sort of partnership with Great Britain and France, that he wanted to work with Poland, that he was trying to deter the Germans, but essentially the British and French didn't do a good job of negotiating. They didn't take the talk seriously. They didn't respect Stalin's interests. And so after tough negotiations in August 1939, Stalin had no choice but to sign an agreement with Germany. Essentially, he couldn't trust the British and French. That's particularly the narrative that people like Vladimir Putin like today and continue to promote. But what actually is revealed, if we look at the diplomatic history and the records and the archives, many of which were not fully available, particularly on the Soviet side, the story looks very different. That story is after Munich, where the Soviet Union was excluded. They were not invited to the Munich conference, where the fate of their ally, Czechoslovakia, was determined. In December of 1938, so well before the actual events of the summer of 1939, the Soviets reached out to the Germans about a massive economic agreement, one that would supply huge quantities of raw material in exchange for German weapons, and that they essentially, I've actually seen the purchase list. We're talking, they wanted to buy every system the Germans had. They wanted to buy entire planes, tanks. They wanted training again. They wanted all of this assistance to return. And basically, they said this is the agreement if you want an economic, some sort of economic partnership. And the Germans came very close to doing it. In fact, they were supposed to dispatch a delegation to Moscow in January 1939. Hitler decides to wait. As soon as the British agreement with Poland in March 1939 is revealed, Germans decide maybe that wasn't such a bad deal. In April and May, there are quiet, low-level talks between Soviet and German diplomats. And by June, there is an extensive economic agreement that is essentially taking shape. In August 1939, when the critical events play out, so the British and French send a delegation in early August, a military delegation to work on a military partnership with the USSR against Germany. By that juncture, there's already essentially a full-fledged potential political alliance on the table between Germany and the Soviet Union, which Stalin is considering. And in fact, the very day the British and French negotiators arrived, we now know that the Politburo agreed to accept a political agreement with Germany. Now, the negotiations themselves take several more weeks because Stalin knows that he is in a great position. He's got the British and French begging for a partnership against Germany, and he's got the Germans eager to invade Poland. And essentially, he is reading many of the diplomatic ciphers. He's got great intelligence. He plays poker with both sides, trying to raise what he can get from the Germans as high as possible. At the end of the day, he gets a great deal. He gets control of the Baltic states. He gets control of part of Moldova. He gets eastern Poland. He gets all sorts of military equipment. And so essentially that is the situation on August 23rd, 1939, when we see Hitler frantically dispatching his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, to Moscow and initialing a deal with Stalin and Molotov, his foreign minister, that essentially partitions Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and sets the stage for broad economic collaboration and military exchange once again.
And I realize this question, again, might be a slightly complicated one to answer, but when the two sides start meeting and talking, are they seeing this as a newer version of the old deals or something completely different? How are they are they coming with all the files of the previous deals and saying, look, back in 22, you said this, or have they thrown all that out and starting the process from again? And are there any figures who were involved in both sets of negotiations, or is it all completely fresh playing field?
No, and this is one of the arguments in my book. They're inextricably linked. So thankfully, we know with certainty the way that people were thinking about this, because Adolf Hitler, in April 1939, when he's giving directions to his foreign ministry to begin really working on a more serious political and economic agreement, he tells them, tell the Russians we want a new Rapallo agreement. So it's very explicit. This is about renewing what had been done, which involved obviously broad political and military collaboration. So Hitler's quite explicit about that. Interesting, there are a number of figures that have been present throughout the entire relationship. So Gustav Hilger, who's in the background of many of the photos of the actual Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, he had been there essentially without break at that juncture for 20 years. He'd been back and forth, but he serves as the translator during key moments of the talks, and he's there the whole time. He writes a book about it actually after the war, where he talks about what that experience is like, working both in the earlier pact and the later one. So particularly on the diplomatic side, both on the German and to a lesser degree the Soviet, a lot of the pieces are the same. They've been at least tangentially in touch off and on over the past 6-7 years, and then they're able to resume their previous partnership.
And in the writing of your book, do we, it's a simple question. When we talk about the Wannsee conference, of course, the 80th anniversary of that was a couple of weeks ago, and we the minutes of that meeting survived. When we're talking about these meetings, and this, the famous signing of it here, but do we have records of the actual things that were said at these meetings, or do we are the versions from the two nations or the sides the same? What do we have to work from? How secret was it? How public was it? What records remain?
Yeah, so the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had two parts. It had a public part that looked very innocuous, said we're not going to attack each other. And then it had a private part that was, of course, very villainous, that involved, obviously, essentially the partition of broad swaths of Eastern and Central Europe, particularly Poland. And there were oral discussions about what the invasion of Poland was going to look like that followed. So everyone should be very clear. This was a joint invasion of Poland, I think. What happens after the Second World War is pretty fascinating, what we know. So there's an official German and Russian version. The Soviets claim that this version did not exist until 1989. They did not acknowledge it. They claimed they had no evidence from their own archives. The German version was captured by the British and American forces at the end of the Second World War. And American forces took the documents, so there were actually copies of the signed version, back to the United States. And it was decided, because at that time relations were still reasonably good between the US and Soviet Union, they would not publish them. But as the Cold War got going, essentially, at one point, the US government tells the Soviets, listen, unless you start behaving differently on a few key matters, we're going to release these documents. The Soviets essentially don't change their position, for instance, over occupied Berlin. And so all of these materials are dumped in a book that's published by the US State Department. Stalin is so irate that we believe, personally writes a 120-page book calling all of these things lies and villainous lies and terrible. But of course, now we know, in fact, they were completely authentic. So the answer is, even quite shortly after the war, we had official documentation indicating what was said and what actually emerged from this agreement.
Well, that was a wonderful, complete answer to that. So we're getting to kind of the real point of this, the thrust of this, which is the reason it all fell down. I mean, because we can kind of understand we can understand the reasons for the deal back in 22. We can understand the mutual benefits they got through the 20s, albeit different from either side. And this deal here, we can understand how it works. But of course, the people who are in that photo there, they can't really think this is going to last very long. So are they coming away from this thinking that do they think it's real? Do they think it's a facade? How long do they think it's going to last? When they're speaking privately, the Germans riding back on the train, for example, what are they saying to themselves about this deal? And similarly, what are the Soviets saying about this deal? Do they each think they've got the best part of it? Do they both think? Just run us through what they're thinking in those next few days and weeks as they're allowing this event to kind of wind down.
Well, the German public is initially quite pleased that there's a sense that this might have averted war. A lot of the officers and diplomats on the German side who've been involved with this whole relationship, they are celebrating, and they think this partnership will be the basis for a new world order, that the borders of Europe can be revised with quite minimal force. They think it's great. However, more senior Nazis, who of course are in most instances rabid anti-communists, they think this is a very temporary agreement. So Joseph Goebbels, in his diary, he says, like the devil, we're going to have to eat flies for a couple of years, but invariably, we're going to come to blows. This is a ceasefire in a war between fascism and communism. The Soviets, for their part, there's certainly no naivete. There's a sense that we need to maximize what we get out of this relationship because Hitler obviously cannot be trusted. Stalin seems to think that war is likely by 40 or 43, that he's bought a number of years, but war is not imminent, that he will not be betrayed immediately. And I will note, especially as Sean McMeekin's book, Stalin's Wars, shows, and I've seen elements of this too, I think his argument that Stalin was quite hopeful that this agreement meant that the Germans would go to war with Great Britain and France, all three countries would exhaust each other, he was able to stay relatively neutral and wait to intervene to the opportune moment, or not intervene at all, whatever it might be. But hopefully, in his mind, spread communism across much of Central and Western Europe. So in his mind, that is the more likely outcome than a German invasion when he actually signs the agreement.
But in a sense, they both think they've come away with something that is going to benefit them and not going to immediately fall apart. I mean, because again, when we look at the casual mentions of this in casual books about World War II, tend to say, as soon as they talk about the deal, the pact, they kind of say something like it was doomed to failure, or it was inevitable, it wasn't going to work. So there's this sense of this predictability about it not going to work. But what you've explained is actually at the time there is high hopes from both sides that it is actually going to cause, to work out for both nations.
Yeah, and I think the critical moment in the relationship actually comes in November of 1940. So at this juncture, France has been defeated. The Germans and Soviets have conquered most of the territories they had agreed to divide between them. And Hitler invites Molotov, the foreign minister, to Berlin for this extended conference, November 12th through 14th. And what Hitler says essentially is, let's double down. Why doesn't the Soviet Union join the Axis in exchange for entering the war against Great Britain? In exchange, we will give you broad swaths of the Middle East. We will expand our economic partnership. We'll do all, you can have India, he says. Basically on offer is a much more extensive alliance. And the Soviets, they play hardball. They come back with a counteroffer that requires the Germans to withdraw from a number of territories in southeastern Europe and the Balkans, make more concessions with regard to Finland, all these other things. And Hitler essentially says, Stalin wants too much, we're done. And shortly after that back and forth, he issues orders for planning for Operation Barbarossa. So the alliance is, in November 1940, it could have become much more extensive, but it's in fact disagreements about what a long-term alliance would look like, and the failure of those that leads to the collapse of the partnership. So it's not rock solid, certainly. They never trust each other. But there is a possibility that this would have become essentially the defining alliance of the World War.
Which brings us back to this point now about this idea about what we can call it. Is it a deal? Is it a friendship? Is it an agreement? Is it a pact? Is it a relationship? Because all of those words have these connotations and meanings, and at the root of it, as you just said there, they don't trust each other. They don't like each other's ideologies. They hate each other. So it is a deal with the devil. It is a deal that you've not really want to do, even though you can feel, from which either side you're looking at it from, it has these benefits, but it's going against your core principles.
Absolutely. And we see both the Germans and Soviets struggle with how to define this too. They do talk occasionally about this as an alliance, but it doesn't seem to quite reach that point, except for a few key moments in 1939 and 1940. They talk about it as a partnership. One of the phrases that I like very much that maybe sums it up, a German diplomat refers to this as a community of fate, that essentially the two states were tied together for good or for evil. That was his expression. I think that maybe sums it up.
I was going to mention that community of fate line at some point, because it's as bad as good as I've ever read in sort of summing up this. I feel I'm using the wrong word: relationship, pact, deal, partnership. As I said, that none of these words is wholly satisfactory. But of course, Barbarossa. So we have to examine what, we take on why Hitler invaded and the Soviet reaction to it and how it all fell apart. And from a non-military point of view, although of course that is relevant, having studied all this relationship, this 20-year history, why do you think that Hitler does, in a sense, press the button? Is there one moment, or is it a whole series of things? What actually commits him to making that huge statement?
Well, certainly, from the very beginning, the destruction of the Soviet Union and the occupation of broad chunks of the USSR and their resettlement with ethnic Germans, this was at the core of his vision. And he returns to the vision in 1940. If we look at really his relationship with Stalin between 1939 through 1941, already by the summer of 1940, he's ordering overflights of Soviet territory. He wants to know what sort of military capacities the Soviets have. Their disastrous performance in the Winter War against Finland clearly plays a big role in his thinking. He thinks that the Soviet military, particularly as a consequence of the purges, has greatly harmed its chances of being a functioning and fighting force. In addition, it's important to note that German intelligence about the USSR, in part because of this long-standing relationship, really underestimates what the Red Army is capable of and the scope and scale of Soviet military industry. So you have officers like Guderian, when he's asked by Hitler to brief him on the Soviet Union, he says, "I was there a lot in the early 30s. They didn't have any effective military technology. They were terribly trained. They weren't capable of producing high quality equipment." He said, I'm not worried, essentially. And we consistently see that sort of reply. I was there, I know, and they're not something to be consistently worried about. And of course, this plays a great role in the disastrous underestimation of Soviet strength, capacity, and economic might when Barbarossa is actually launched. So I think it's a combination of Hitler's attempt to obviously achieve these longstanding ideological goals, a sense that there's a moment of opportunism here, the Soviet Union is weak, as well as an underestimation of what it would actually take to defeat the Soviet Union.
And we've had the comment coming aside, but of course that oil, raw materials are, of course, and Adam Tooze, when he was on the channel, talked about that. It's in the back of everybody's mind there, Soviet or German, is if a war is coming, where you're going to get your stuff from: arms, munitions, oil, rubber, all those things there. So that's in everybody's mind there. But I like the fact there, and what you do in your book. And again, folks, I'm going to hold it up there, and it is definitely, just go and get it. Just agree with me, go and do it. I'm just going to buy it, do it now, right now. But how important this working relationship back in the 20s have been. What you said there about the Germans who've been there, and they're dismissive of the Russian, I don't know, not their technology, not their ideology, but they're just their way of doing things could be well, they just don't worry about them. It's this underestimation of them, and the fact that the Germans had developed their own technology in the Soviet Union they probably saw it as without the Soviets giving any help to it. It was all us. We were the ones we were the brains in this, I guess they're thinking. So in a sense, have we as historians, as we who've written about this, talked about that, have we overlooked the importance of that 1920s era on the thinking of these key figures.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's my sense. I mean, it's remarkable if we look at the actual state of German military intelligence on the eve of the invasion. German military has literally hundreds of senior officers who speak Russian and have lived in the Soviet Union, and in many instances actually wore Red Army uniforms during their time in the Soviet Union. And yet the head of military intelligence on the Soviet Union is a junior officer who doesn't speak Russian, who has almost no staff, and is also responsible for North America. It's amazing how poor German intelligence was about the USSR on the eve of the invasion. And I think one of the only explanations that make sense is there was a certain contempt bred by familiarity, where these senior German officers, so many of whom had lived in the USSR, essentially they assumed they knew what they were getting into. And obviously there are officers who oppose the invasion, quite a few of them, but those who were keen, there seems to be a consistent thread of believing that the Soviet Union was not capable of effective resistance based on those early experiences.
And also the fact that since at that time in the 20s, when the cooperation had been at its peak, things have changed in both countries. The Soviet Union have developed things. They haven't taken, because we didn't really bring up the idea of the sort of spying and the secrecy, because there's obviously neither side back in the 20s, back in the best part of this relationship, was sharing everything with each other. They were obviously both trying to, like in a weird chess game, trying to get as much as they could from the other, but give the least away there. A very odd deal there. So they both probably felt that they had seen everything the other side had, but neither had, in fact. They both thought they'd outwitted the other one. Does that make some sense to you?
Absolutely. And I should note, the Germans showed much of the best material they had because they had nowhere else to test it. The Soviets never revealed the best equipment that they had to their German counterparts. And we see this play out a little bit when we look at Guderian's response to seeing a T-34 for the first time, or Hitler's comment that if he knew the Soviets were producing such tanks, he wouldn't have invaded at all. There was some shock because they thought they'd seen what the USSR had. And in fact, by 1939, Soviet military industry is producing a lot of quite high quality aircraft and tank designs in huge quantities. And the Germans are just not prepared for that reality.
I guess if you're a German military officer, tank officer, and you've been charting the developments through perhaps you've been going there every year for 7 or 8 years, you've been charting this progression, and in your mind, you've drawn a sort of a mental line of how it's going up each year. I'm guessing that in that period when they weren't going there, the sort of 37, 38, 39, what they didn't know is the curve was going up much, much steeper that last. But as you said there, when we talk about Soviet tank development, and indeed, and in German tank development, that 38, 39 period, and we can be talking about the Spanish Civil War next week on the channel and the tank combat there that leads to changes. That curve rapidly accelerated then, which means if they're basing it on how they were predicting the curve to go, it has changed from both sides' point of view. So they are in a position where they underestimate each other's potential.
Absolutely. And I should note, the Soviets got very good, not just at borrowing or stealing technology. By the 30s, they have very impressive design bureaus of their own. They're capable of taking the best of foreign industries, but really developing terrific indigenous designs. And so that, again, was something the Germans had not expected.
Wow. So, well, I think we've come to the end of where my questions are now. It's about time, given that we're an hour and 10 minutes in, to open it up to you guys out there watching for some questions for Ian now about either about the earlier deal or the later deal, or what you think about Barbarossa. But now would be the time to kind of ask those questions there. And I just want to thank you all for your comments there, and people, lots of, I didn't know this, I had no idea about this. Thank you very much for filling in these gaps. That's always good when we feel we're kind of broaching new subjects here. So, question here from Susan. I mean, no, not that one. The standing armies are the two. Had the Germans? We talked about technology, and the Germans maybe not realizing what the Soviets were developing into technology. What about numbers? What about the sheer numbers? Because obviously, you're said that even though they had these many bases back in the 20s, there are many, many more bases they didn't get to. So, how much of the Red Army's size was a mystery to the Germans?
Quite a bit. They underestimated the number of divisions that were stationed in Eastern Europe by sometimes as much as 100 divisions in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. It should be noted that the Soviet military had gone from about 1.5 million men and women in 1939 to almost about 5 million in total, just on the army side, in rapid expansion. This was super chaotic. Roger Rees has written the best work on this, in my opinion. So the expansion is incredibly rapid. One reason the Germans underestimate it. It's also very haphazard. There aren't enough officers. There aren't enough skilled and trained men. There really are not enough skilled technicians. And the Soviet Air Force is like 40% below where it's supposed to be in terms of officer and personnel numbers. So the Red Army has become very large, but it is very uneven in terms of its quality, which is, again, one reason the Germans underestimate them. So the German force is attacking the Soviet Union in Barbarossa. It has about 3 million men, of course, between it and then a number of allies contributing forces as well. The Soviets actually outnumber the Germans on the eve of Barbarossa in Eastern Europe, but the Germans believe that their technological advantages and perhaps their lack of awareness of the size of the Red Army means that they will, in fact, have an advantage.
Great. So, and this is more of a question stroke comment there from David Levine saying, and it's a good point to make, because so many books just blame Hitler for Operation Barbarossa, saying it was his folly, it was his madness, it was never have done it, and it always comes out as the top of the poll of the biggest military mistakes of history. The point you're making, in a sense, is that all these people who've been on these exchanges, all these generals, the Mansteins, the Keitels, all these others there, they are just as guilty as Hitler is. So I can understand, as I was saying there, that those that survived the war and those, or perhaps in the war crimes trials, it's an easy one to just blame the dead guy. We've talked about that so often on the channel here. Blame Hitler, he's not there, it's all his fault. But clearly, there are a lot of people at fault there for misunderstanding it, and that again is illuminated by your book. So, any particular other key figures you think should be on that list there of people that feel severely cocked up, basically, in 1941?
Well, I'll note that one thing that shocked me with the book, and I think one of the big takeaways, the German military is dedicated to starting a new offensive war essentially as soon as the First World War ends. And they literally meet while the Treaty of Versailles is being negotiated, discuss the possibility of reopening the fighting. And when they're ordering all these technologies I've talked about, they are extremely explicit about what they're going to be used for. When they order the first tanks, they ask the designers to make sure that the treads and the weight are such that they can be used on any French and Belgian highway or railway. Clearly, they're planning to eventually start a new offensive war and invade these states. And so we see that sort of offensive mindset permeating the upper ranks of the German officer corps all the way through Operation Barbarossa, especially after the swift victories against France and Poland. There's an assumption that they can win this war and win it quickly. And there are dissenters, but I think obviously more people went along with the flow than tried to resist in any meaningful way. And I think one reason is they were quite optimistic and they were quite convinced that offensive warfare was winnable and in Germany's interest. And they'd been committed to this for 2 decades.
Yeah. This is, I think, a really good question from Ivan here about, are there exchanges of military doctrine? We've talked about the sharing of technology and the inevitable understanding of each other's ideologies, but there's this, it's not just what you've got, it's how you use them. So are they actually going there, and German generals or Russians saying, this is how we would deploy fighter aircraft in this? Is any of that going on as well?
Yes, there's a great deal. In the early phases, it's particularly organizational. So the Soviet military is going to reorganize what becomes its general staff on German lines. Semyon Timoshenko, who heads it when the war begins with Germany, he had lived in Germany and he was following that model. You have German instructors at almost all of the major Soviet training academies in European Russia in this period, and they're teaching German tactics, training. One of the big things the Germans brought in, the Soviets used a purely lecture style of training in most of the officer academies. The Germans were all about seminars and exercises and simulations, sand table, war games. They brought a lot of that in, and that led to major changes in training and tactics. There are other areas where we can see clear evolution and evaluation of each other's ideas. So, for instance, the main Soviet military manual in 1936, PU-36, is written by Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who the Germans considered something of a rock star. They thought he was kind of a military genius. It clearly showed a great deal of influence from German ideas, and German ideas clearly showed influence at the same time from ideas that Tukhachevsky then preached while they were in the Soviet Union. So there are clearly elements of the story on each side, tactical and training elements that they derive from each other. The thing is, after the Great Purges, the manuals that had been written and developed in part from German ideas were suppressed. PU-36 was banned, and they rounded it up and destroyed it and released new manuals. So a lot of the ideas themselves, the Germans, or the Soviets would essentially have to relearn in combat, fighting the Germans, rather than relying on what was actually very impressive institutional expertise that was largely destroyed by the purges.
So in a sense, I'm glad you brought that up, because we've highlighted that it was basically the Germans' under-evaluation or under-appreciation of the Soviet strength and the Soviet technology that kind of brought about Barbarossa. But from the other point of view, the Soviet Union had kind of got all the answers and then threw them away. They had stolen the answers to the exam. They did, and then in their purges, they got rid of it. So their mistake was throwing it away. So both sides have made a fundamental error at the end or towards the end of this deal. But we talk more about Barbarossa and Hitler's folly than we do the Soviet mistake. And this, I can think, is basically the point you're making in your book, is that we're not studying this whole period enough. It's way more than just 1939. And to make sense of the 1939 Pact, you've got to go back and look and start basically in 1919. It's 20 years that leads this, not just 1 year. So what's the future? We're going to maybe do a couple more questions if we've got them in, but I was talking to Helen Roche about the NAPOLA, the Third Reich schools, and how she's the first person to write that book, and now it will become an area for study, and she'd like to see it carry on. I know people like yourself, Roger Morehouse, have written about this before, but what's next? We talk a lot about the opening up of archives and the digitalization of things like that. So the next generation of people who are looking at this era, what is there to find out now? Is there more archives to find out? Is more about reanalyzing what we already have?
Well, I think that there's still material that we don't have full access to that would be very exciting, particularly in Russia, that either I didn't have access to, and future historians likely won't have access to, at least for a while. I think there's a lot still out there, and there are pieces of the story that we also don't understand very well, or we're just seeing the first works published on. Like, for instance, the fact that throughout this period, the Germans and Soviets are competing in China. The German General Hans von Zech, who I mentioned, he goes and is trained in the Chinese military, a key figure in the rise of nationalist China's army and in the Chinese Civil War. And the Soviets also have a presence there and a significant role. They're because the Chinese archives are so difficult to access right now. This is part of the story we don't know at all, but ends up playing a role in the outbreak of the Second World War in East Asia, but is really a spin-off effect of the same relationship. So there's actually, it's always amazes me, but I think there's a great deal left to discover about the Second World War and the lead up to it.
Well, and this brings up the other side we've talked about, is China is the big one. We still have yet to kind of peel back the layers of that to any degree. And of course, China's relationship with the Soviet Union is another whole big subject that is underexplored. And China's role in the beginning of World War II is underexplored, underappreciated. But a rather simple question, I don't mean simple in the sense of dismissing it, but from being there over in Australia, about, is there a kind of an official date or a last kind of time the Soviets and Germans met up in any kind of military capacity in the Soviet Union? Was it in the 35, 30, or was there still things going on after 1939 of delegations going back and forth?
So there are elements of direct military collaboration that resume with the molotov-ribbentrop Pact. So the biggest is that the Soviets offer a naval base on Soviet territory for use of the German Navy, Basis Nord, which opens in 1939. And they say, yeah, you want to park submarines up there to go after British shipping? Great. And in fact, one of the most remarkable stories of the war, Tobias Philbin has written about this, the Soviets are going to send 2 icebreakers to lead German merchant raiders across the Arctic, the large, at that time, very, very difficult passage. These icebreakers lead German merchant raiders into the Pacific, where they proceed. One of them captures or sinks 14 British ships before circumnavigating the globe and getting back to Germany. And guess what? The merchant raider was flying a Soviet flag most of the time to conceal its identity from the ships it was attacking. So that sort of collaboration goes on essentially up until Germany's betrayal in 1941. In the earlier period, it's mostly German engineers who are still in the country through 35. The last military officers are departing in the fall of 1939. And there are a couple of rather angry dinners and drinks events at this period where the Soviets are saying, why are you abandoning this partnership? We're all getting so much out of this. In their cups, they're being perhaps a little more honest about how much the Soviets have come to rely on the Germans and saying, this is all on you. Germany, you're breaking this relationship when you don't need to. So we see some recriminations in that moment in really September, October of 1939 when the last German officers leave at that moment.
Okay. And I think my last question will be, it's been out a few months now, the book. What's the reaction been to it? I mean, that's again a large question there. But you're talking about the fact you went to Moscow, you went to Germany. I mean, have the people in these countries you were working with responded to it and said, "Well, we didn't know that," and are they? Just give us an idea of where you are now, because there's that moment when you submit a book and it goes off and you don't know what kind of feedback you're going to get. And I had this discussion with Sean McMeekin about his Stalin book, and someone reminded me on a comment the other day that his book is nonsense, basically, they said. And you go, well, okay, you haven't read it then. But what's the reaction been, and has it led you to think about doing something else to continue the study of this particular period? But we'll do the reaction to it first.
Yeah, it's I've been very flattered by, generally the reaction has been quite positive. And I think the sense is, even for people who are familiar with this period, they didn't know some of the technological, the training, what was inside the black box of these various secret facilities and how that linked to the outbreak of the Second World War. Again, I was very fortunate to have a ton of people smarter than myself helping me figure out where those sources were and structure the book in that way. In Russia, the reaction has been interesting to say the least. Putin is deeply interested in history himself before the book came out, but after I'd written pieces in places like the Wall Street Journal, he actually wrote a lengthy op-ed in English about the origin of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I'll say is it's very well written. It's a position that 20 years ago would have been reasonable. He says, the Soviets had no choice. Stalin was just protecting the USSR. He wanted to work with the British and French. Earlier cooperation didn't matter. I don't think that's a position we can really hold anymore. So I think he's fundamentally wrong, and then makes it unlikely that I'll be going back to the Russian Federation in the near future. Unfortunately, I love Moscow. I have a lot of friends and fond memories, but the Russian reaction I don't think has been as positive. In Germany, I think there's been I actually had a lot of support from German scholars who've been very supportive and helped me with elements of the book. So they've helped to promote it and written some fairly positive things, which has been really, really great. So I'm flattered people are interested in the story. I'm glad. Some people think that it adds something new to our understanding of the Second World War.
Well, it definitely does. And I just want to say to folks who've been commenting why I'm so pink today, my camera updated its settings and I've suddenly gone pink. There did that show ages ago why I went really red with Alan Allport, that was. So I'm aware I look very pink. I've not been overdoing it on a sunbed. It's blame the camera updating itself and the reason I look pink. But to bring it back to your book, I think, I said at the beginning it was a game changer. I think I realized, while you've been talking, I've realized what it is. I think the books I read about this before have come from the political diplomatic side and therefore have overlooked the technology, aircraft, tank type side of things, because those fields of history have become a little bit separated, and it's bringing the two back together. Yes, we want to understand the diplomacy, the politics, the meetings, the minutes, all that side of things, but it tends to me to think that the people who write about tank development do that from a separate field as those who write about the debate. And your book does both. I think that's why it will appeal to the people who want to know about Christie tank suspensions, as well as it will those who like political intrigue. I think that's where it provides something very special. So I like the idea of those two worlds coming together. It's like we talk about Holocaust study being separate from battle study, and I'm firmly of the opinion you cannot separate the two. The outcome of the battles is directly connected to the Holocaust and vice versa. The simple fact that Zyklon B developed to kill Russian officers captured in Barbarossa, rather than getting rid of the Jewish population. So things like that. It's the war that connects that. So I like that approach of bringing the military and the political side together. And generally, because you teach military history, don't you?
I do, yes.
So do you think those two fields have got a little bit separated over the years, and there's the people who write for the political fans and those who write for the tank warfare fans. Is that a problem you've seen developing recently, or in the last 20 years maybe?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And part of it is sources. We've had great access to German diplomatic documents since 1946. And so I think, especially on the diplomatic side, interwar period is pretty well covered, and a lot of great stuff has been written. But no one's done the military history, or not, obviously not no one, but not as fully. It just has not been as rich. And so my hope has been to connect those literatures a little bit and add more military history to our understanding of the interwar period.
Well, definitely, and it's amazing. Sometimes I'm reading a book that I'm really engrossed in because they've got the political side of things down, and then they get a tank design wrong, or they mention something about an artillery piece that's clear, and I go, and I know I shouldn't really kind of lose faith at that moment, but I go, oh, because I know they're not an armory person, they're not a gun person. It doesn't really matter, but it always, I sigh a little bit. And the same time, and equally, if I'm reading a kind of book about tanks and aircraft, they make a comment about the political side of it and it's wrong, I kind of sigh a little bit. You want both. You want both of these things to be understood in parallel to get the complete picture. So that's what I think. So yeah, folks, I'm going to remind you once again, it is definitely worth getting. Faustian bargain. I did my little book reviews of Game Changers all 6 months ago. I'll have to do a Mark II version because this is one of my new game-changing books. So I will have to do one of them. So, folks, thank you for sticking with us there. I'm going to say thank you to Ian in a minute, but I'll just remind you that next week, I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second, Ian. Next week, we are starting Armored Actions. So we're looking at the Spanish Civil War on Monday. We're looking with Prit Buttar at some of the fighting in the Ukraine from the German point of view this time. Normally, Prit comes on and talks about the Soviets. This time, he's talking about the Germans. Some great shows. We're looking at Stuart tanks in New Guinea. Great week of shows coming up, and then after that we've got Special Forces Week coming up. So as usual, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Don't forget to become a member of the channel, share what we're doing on social media, and above all, spread the word. So right now, I was just going to say thank you to Ian for joining us. Thank you everybody else for putting up with my pinkness today. I'll resolve that before Monday. Did you have a good time talking to the viewers of World War II TV, Ian?
Oh, it was my great pleasure. Yes.
Thank you. So that was great. So enjoy your weekend, folks. I will see you all again on Monday. Well, Sunday night, we've got our one-off. We've got our examination of the battle in the Netherlands in January 1945 with Edward Popkin. That'll be fantastic. We haven't done a proper battlefield stream for some time, so I'm looking forward to that one. I would give you the name of the title of where we're going, but it's one of those Dutch names that I would have to practice saying before Sunday, and I haven't got it remembered yet. But it's a Dutch battle in January 1945. Check it out on YouTube. So, folks, this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I will see you all again on Sunday for this one-off show, Monday for Armored Action Week. Thanks, everybody. Cheers. Bye.